Namaste.
Now, welcome everyone. So let's begin right away with the consecration to assimilate these teachings and content, ask for correct understanding, support. You know the drill. As we introduced in the first video, you can close your eyes, bring your attention quick through a body scan, releasing all tension, feeling heaviness dropping down to your seat, to the earth. Letting go of anything that feels tense or heavy. And from the background of this, perceive the lightness floating up, all the way up, the crown, top of your head, upper end of your energy envelope. And then from here, focus on the center of your crown point. Let us deliberately renounce the identification, the doership, the authorship, the karma and merit, these activities, including mental and verbal actions as well. And instead ask for this to be to your own benefit and the benefit of all that you maybe be in touch with and the ones you may touch directly or indirectly in your future. With firm focus on your crown, deliberately express the intent to relinquish the authorship, the doership, giving up the karma, as well as the fruits and merits of these actions. And ask for support, for grace in your own words now. Begin. And then begin to bring this to a conclusion. Settling back in your center area of the chest, your heart, while remaining with some amount of your awareness throughout this session, also above the head, your crown, and then with a deep breath in, coming back. And in your own time, open the eyes. So, namaste. Welcome to you all to today's session. Look, what do we have in store for today?
I have some questions prepared, but actually I just think let's just go with it. What's like a topic that's grabbing you recently that's really inspiring you that you've been looking into? That's what I'm interested in, really.
Well, there's always quite a few things on my mind that spike my curiosity. However, one thing that I keep coming back to is the kind of the fundamental way in which we approach the world that comes from mental models, that comes from approaches how we think about the world, how we relate to the world. And while there may be many different flavors and perspectives through which we can, in a sense, prism reality, some people may be, let's say, more in tune with acoustics and they can close their eyes and from listening to music, to a tune, to a verbal recitation, they can be carried away and transported in a sense, as it were, into a different realm. Other people are more visually stimulated. They can really become captivated by the interplay of colors, by the expression of a mood, of a thought, of an idea, of an energy. Whereas other people express themselves more through skin, touch, physical action, or visceral experience, and so on. The list could continue. However, there is a common denominator in the sense that we are all human, and that means all our experiences, the ones which I have within my own spectrum, but also by extension what other people have within their spectrum, there is a common denominator. There are common principles, there are common ways. While I can have my own preferences, let's say, tastes, beliefs, opinions, and so on, judgments, nevertheless, there is a common denominator of reality, which is not subjective, which is universal. So that means it's the same within you, within me, within somebody, or let's say somebody with high morality, somebody with lower morality, somebody who we may favor as opposed to somebody we may oppose, and so on. Nevertheless, there is a common substrate. And that substrate, while it's very tempting to say, well, that on the most basic level, we know that there's rocks and apples and like all these inanimate objects in the physical world. And we tend to be biased towards that approach of looking at the world as being a machine, something inanimate and something unconscious, because that's the spectrum, that's the scope with which we've been trained, educated, often also rewarded, right? If you have exams in school, let's say, if you go through performances, through, let's say, corporations, through governments, whatever your involvement has been with the consensual reality, the physical world that we share, there is usually some sort of engagement and some sort of reward based on a particular model, which tends to be biased towards the material. And if I want to simply achieve a material object, let's say if I want to dig a hole that's 1 meter deep, then I can say, okay, all I need is a tool for that. I get a shovel and I start digging, or an excavator or whatever. And then I make progress and I can measure from the surface. And at some point, it's like, okay, I accomplished my task. So for material tasks, our measures, our models tend to be very useful, often very precise, since we've trained them, since we trained the tools, the technologies, the ways of measuring things, we have standards and so on. However, it tends to bias our whole experience towards that the physical is the only thing that matters. And I remember in an earlier session, maybe it was the first or second one, I briefly touched upon this, that yes, while we do have an objective standard for things, which is important, which is useful for engineering, which is useful for things to be compatible, that we have the same understanding of, let's say, the width of the road, so that our cars can share from different producers, they can all share the same road. It is useful for engineering purposes and in a way logistically relevant. However, it's in a way a slight distortion if we then get sucked into the frame of reference, the frame of mind, that the primary reality that is relevant to us as sentient beings is the physical one. And this is demonstrated by experiments like, I mean, you can do this as a thought experiment, and it's not much different. If you have a physical experience, probably you had this experience before, one way or another. You come from a hot environment, like let's say sauna, and you come into a pool that is more or less neutral, like let's say room temperature, and you perceive the water to be quite cold and refreshing. Whereas if you come from the ice bath and you're cold and shivering, let's say, you go into the same pool, the same room temperature, it may feel very warm. And the objective measure is, of course, well, we have standards to measure temperature, and we can take like one of these laser pointers or a diode or whatever we want to use to say, well, this water is exactly that type of temperature, and therefore we would attribute the perception of something being either warm or cold being a subjective distortion, that it's like we say, oh, this is subjective in a almost like in a derogatory way, saying like, oh, you're not being objective, you're not really amounting to the level of being a fair judge, but you are biased because of your particular situation. And again, for certain general cases, that is an appropriate view to have. If we want to measure the performance of a machine, for example, then we very much want to have an objective measure and not just a subjective performance, because then another person may have a different opinion and everything becomes very much confusing, distorted, unreliable, and so on. However, on the basis of our existence in the human condition, being human, having a human life, being conscious, having sentience, our entire experience is nothing else than a chain of successive impressions, or we could say also parallel impressions, if you want to say you have visual impression and acoustic and sensory of different kinds. And I would like to kind of revisit this, that the subjective is ultimately not something to be looked down upon. It's not something inferior. It is just something particular that is more relevant for more subtle experiences. Let's say in a dream, for example, you may have all sorts of rich experiences, whereas as far as the objective measures go, you can't really measure the weight of something in a dream or the speed or the distance. All of those measures, the only way that they're accessible is subjective, because we don't share a physical space where our ordinary measures would operate. We could measure some EKG, right? We could have like hook ourselves up with electrodes and measure the brain activities and stimulation. To some extent, you can infer things from, let's say, the heart rate changes, the breathing pattern changes. Yet, obviously, these type of measures are very crude when compared with the nuances and the richness that is possible in the astral, like in the dream worlds. And the dream is just one example that I'm now going to invoke, since everyone dreams and everyone at least has some memory. Some people say like, I don't dream every night, or some people say like, I hardly ever remember a dream. Yes, but if you get hooked up to an EKG, that much we can confirm, that everyone goes into REM phase, where you have dream phases where the eyes move. And if you would wake people up in that moment, they will actually say like, oh wait, I was in the middle of a dream. So the phenomenon of a dream is something very common. Also is the phenomena of daydreaming. We've all had it, that maybe we were sitting in a train and gazing out the window, or we were listening, or some, maybe it has happened at school, at the university, that you're, or some other presentation, you're sitting through something and your mind kind of wanders off and you get sucked into, sometimes it's a fantasy, sometimes it's a memory, sometimes it's a curiosity, but it's not an immediate perception of perceiving your chair, your skin, your clothes, the immediate environment. So this kind of ability to dissociate is something that we're all familiar with. And yet this now poses a challenge in a sense of ontologically, like what do we now postulate that to fundamentally exist? Because if we say, well, I'm a physical body, I have a bunch of atoms, I'm made out of physical matter, and then somehow within that I'm conscious, then okay, then I can say now let's say I hallucinate an idea, a vision. Let's say right now I'm not on a beach, I can think of a beach, I can project myself as a vision, a memory where I have been on a beach or where I will be on a beach. And we can say, okay, then that is kind of like something that is simulated, that is made up, right? This is now where we goes into this simulation theory, where we have the different approaches today. Sometimes some of them are philosophical questions that people ask, but it's also technical questions, in the sense of like, how likely, how realistic is it that the reality that we perceive is really fundamental, and it's really that there's really a chair here that I'm sitting on, there's really a table in front of me, and there's really trees behind me, and so on. Or to what extent is it more like a video game, like that in a way, because I'm looking somewhere, the video game, the simulation is rendering something. And the challenge with both of these is that they suggest some fundamental disconnect, that there's the physical, like the hardware reality, and then you could say that the software reality where we imagine things. But now we have two domains where we want to use them in the same sentence, like I'm alive, I have a heartbeat, I have a breath, I can measure these things, and I can infer from my brain states, from like neurons going on and off, that I have some neurological experience. That means that there's some activity in the neurological state that then somehow generates the vision, the internal. And again, the vision applies both in a creative sense when I'm envisioning, let's say, a yellow elephant in a pink Ferrari or something I've never seen. I can very easily generate that image in my mind, or I can recall a scene where I saw, I don't know, a car stop at an intersection that I actually remember as a memory. The faculties internally are very similar, whether we access a memory and therefore regenerate an experience which we have recorded, or whether we make something up completely new. Now, this is approaching this from the bottom up. The problem with this is that the more we get from a crude experience, from a crude stimulus, from a physical, very limited, the physical reality is very confined, very specific. And the more we go into these astral realms, these subtle realms were similar to dreaming and daydreamings, and there's different, a whole spectrum of states. Some of them are more defined, some of them are more vague. And everyone has probably had this experience where in a dream, something seems perfectly obvious or rational or self-consistent because we make some check, we even can think, we can rationalize, we can follow a logic, we can follow a thread, and everything makes perfect sense. This is especially apparent if you have a kind of like a stress-based dream, meaning there's some factor, either you're pressured because of time, or there's a challenge to overcome or a problem to solve, and it seems very important in the dream. It seems relevant. It seems clear. The challenge, or maybe sometimes there's an opposition. Maybe there's somebody else that you have a contest with, or whatever the scenario may be. In the dream, it seems perfectly sober, clear, adequate, and then you wake up. You're like, wait, this makes no sense. Wait, there were all sorts of options. Like I tried to climb over a fence where I could just have walked around. And somehow in the dream, I didn't realize that there was an option to just go back and go around and come from the other side. Somehow I limited myself. I made myself believe. I perceived reality to be more limited than it really was. And this is something that is true on all levels. It's this self-consistency that is a faculty of the mind. Like you have a challenge to entertain things that are internally contradictory, right? Like a paradox, for example. It bothers us often. We want to find a solution. It has to be one way or another. That is when we're aware that there's a conflict. Now, most of the time we're not aware. Most of the time we believe one thing in one situation and believe another thing in another situation. And we're kind of subconsciously hiding the fact that we're kind of flip-flopping around. And this is the case with how science is being done, how we generally approach the material work. We can always trivialize a situation and pretend like something is very finite, very firm, very limited, very trivial, very material. And in any given situation, that actually works quite well. It's like watching a river and see the water flow and taking a picture, and then looking at the picture and zooming in and say, like, look, everything is still, nothing moves. And then you take another picture and then you analyze it again. It's like, look, everything seems very solid, everything seems very defined. And yet it's quite obvious that when you look at the river, that there is motion, that there's a constant change. And yet, even if you take a video, you can take the video, go frame by frame and look at the different pictures. And then you realize, like, no, they're actually all stills. And so now what is more real? The thing which is flowing, is there a fundamental continuity? Is there a continuity between where the water was, let's say, before, and then where it is after, and it was everywhere in between? Or was it in one place, then it sort of teleported to the next step, then it teleported to the next step, then it teleported to the next step, and so on. Much of the tools that we use in terms of thinking, in terms of how we model data, we can only really deal with later with this kind of fragmented part. This goes all the way to the foundation. Let's say even the way we use numbers, we all learn, okay, we have the whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have the rational numbers, like anything that can be expressed as a ratio, and they are, unfortunately, we don't really use them all too much. And then we often go to the real numbers and say, like, well, the definition of a real number is basically that whatever two numbers are, you can always find arbitrary many numbers in between. Let's say if I have 1 and 2, I can have 1.5 and 1.2.5 and 1.1.2.3, whatever, right? I can add decimal places, and even if I have two numbers that are similar to the hundredth decimal place, I can just add one more decimal place and squeeze another number in between. So it seems very useful that we can always inject more numbers. But the problem with that approach is that this poses a severe limitation because it removes this continuity. Whereas in human experience, let's say I'm in the house and I want to get into the car. Yeah, maybe there's different ways of how I go around the furniture, and whether maybe I have more than one door that I can leave the house from. Then I get into the car, and there may be different paths. Maybe I go walk around the tree one way, or I walk around the trash can the other way. So there's many different ways to get there, but all that matters is that from the beginning to the end, I have a contractible path. And then the logistics is just one point, beginning, destination, and whatever happens in between that whole interval in a way can be contracted. But this doesn't work if you have to reconstruct the path from the building blocks, because then you always have this atomization, that you have something broken apart, and then everything starts to look like a hopeless mess, or just like a copy of multiple similar things. And due to this lack of continuity, then it can seem very difficult, very confusing. Then we start to have trouble with entropy, that things are chaotic, that they are tending towards becoming more random. And so psychologically, we then are trapped in a framework of, oh, we need to respond and manage reality. Like everything seems to be falling apart, and we need to maintain an effort for things to retain coherence, to remain stable, to remain oriented, to preserve the pattern, to prevail in terms of existence. And while, again, for engineering purposes, this is valid and useful to some extent, however, as a philosophy, it is quite unhealthy and problematic, because it tends us to it confronts us with ways of thinking, of modeling reality, where things constantly seem to be going off the track. They constantly seem to be falling apart. It constantly seems to be some source of worry or anxiety that things seem to deteriorate. And just to remind ourselves, we have an example that is doing the exact opposite. And this is anything that we consider to be alive, from plants to animals to humans. It constantly seems to find a way to assimilate resources from the environment, whether that is sunlight or some organic matter, for example, that the plants absorb, or that we ingest, or that we exchange with the atmosphere, or that we exchange through other membranes, through the skin boundary, and so on. And then we regenerate the pattern, right? If you have the pattern, I mean, a human is a fairly complex pattern, but the same idea applies also to whirlpool, or a knot in a string that you can slide around. You can change the material. You can go from the part of the thread which is silk to the one which is cotton to the one which is hemp, and so on, and slide the pattern around. And once it's made out of one material, and then you slide it, and it is substituted by the material as you slide it, and it is made up of another material. And the same is true with us humans, right? We keep eating food, and the food gets digested, gets used to rebuild cells, to rebuild muscle tissues, and so on, and bones. Like actually, all of our physical body is replaced within whatever it is, 7 to 12 years. I'm never quite sure that in that window. So we ourselves are a pattern that completely gets substituted throughout our lives, and yet we can have memories that go back further than 7 years. So in a way, the pattern is more fundamental than the material, because that means also my brain, my physical brain cells have been replaced over the past years. So how can I have a memory that goes back further? And it's not like the memories are actually inside my skull, right? This is what you can talk with any neuroscientist and neurologist. They can show you which areas are involved if you go into a visual memory or a textual, like a language based acoustic verbal memory, or a textual memory, that you recall a piece of information, that it gets reconstructed and recovered in the brain. Yet ultimately, what the brain does is it generates a hallucination. It generates a vision, a subtle experience in the image of the original stimulus. And we subjectively recognize that original stimulus, yet it's not guaranteed. And it's very often not as exact of a replica as we believe ourselves it to be, because we ourselves are generating in the way how we remember it. So for us, it always feels self-consistent. And there's been interesting studies, for example, that if you don't touch a memory, if something happened a decade ago, and now today you're asked about, oh, remember that one time when this and this and this and this happened, something that you didn't think about for years and years, and you remember, oh wait, there was this colored jacket there, or there was this incident, and we I don't know, we unloaded something from a car or somewhere out, whatever specific detail that you remember, there's a high degree chance that this is a very accurate recovery of what happened back then, assuming you remember, right? If you're not just making things up, if you actually have a memory, you can have a much higher confidence in that memory, as opposed if that memory was something that kept on bothering you and you kept remembering it and thinking about it and going back to it and thinking about it and forgetting about it and going back to remembering it again. Because every time we relive, we re-invoke a memory, we regenerate the subtle experience, we then remember that the experience that we generate is then a flavor that we add to the original memory. So every time we access the memory, we actually slightly modify the memory. It doesn't mean that the history changed, but our memory of the history changed. So the memories we relive more often, in a way, are less reliable. That doesn't mean that they're not that they're not necessarily correct. Maybe our mind and our memory and how we feel about it has been very stable, and thus it's possible that if we remain the same, that our memories through multiple regenerations and reinvocation has prevailed and has remained the same. Yet it is more likely that there was some amount of drift that gradually modified and gradually changed the memory through constant reliving of that memory. And so the question then becomes, well, what is more fundamental? Because if the physical reality is more constrained, we can say, okay, we can be more exact about the physical reality. Let's say we can measure time quite exactly. We have very sophisticated clocks these days, especially the very advanced ones that they can measure. Even last year's Nobel Prize was awarded because they built essentially a very, very fancy clock that was very, very, whatever it was called, attosecond physics, I think. So like less than a billionth of a second. I don't remember. It was like a trillionth of a second. I was like, it's very, very, very precise measurement. And yet we have subjectively all experienced that sometimes time passes very quickly and sometimes time passes very slowly. So if something is unpleasant, it seems to go on forever and ever and ever and ever. Or sometimes also it doesn't have to be that we only rush through the positive experience and we retain the unpleasant ones. Sometimes we have an unpleasant experience and it's almost like we have an out-of-body experience and we don't really experience the pain or discomfort while it's going on. And then once it's over, it's like, oh my God, it's like return back to my body, and I know that the time has passed, but I didn't really perceive the whole duration because I was kind of like dissociated somewhere else. The same is, of course, the case when we are in a positive experience, that we may be very involved, but it can also be we can become so involved that we completely forget about time, and time just passes without us really being aware of it. So again, this is a subjective notion of duration. Before I made an example with the temperature, with the hot cold. And the deeper we examine this, the more this dualistic two-domain reality begins to produce problems. We run into problems more and more the more we pay attention to details. Again, if it's just like a superficial, okay, I make a model of the world, I just throw a bunch of boxes on a piece of paper and I give them a bunch of names and I draw a bunch of arrows, how they're related to each other, or however we make it a diagram as an abstraction. That's perfectly fine to have a copy, like a replica about the real world. But when we want to reconcile these two domains, it's not really possible within the parameters that we can observe, within the information that is accessible, for example, through the retina which then consumes or absorbs the stimulus through its cones, right? The kind of the stimulus where you have bright and darkness perceptors and red, green, blue perception that gets fed through the channels back to the brain, and then gets broken up into whatever 20, 21 or so different visual perception centers where we process and trace different components of the field. For example, how fast something is moving and in which direction it is moving, whether it's coming closer to us or away from us, or whether it's parallel to us. Yet the image is never reassembled. And this now becomes quite troubling, because usually we are told a story, something along the lines of, oh, vision happens because we have all this light bouncing around and it hits our photons and then it gets fed back. And then in the brain, somehow the brain hallucinates this reality based on a stimulus. Like the stimulus is primary. There is an actual object here. It imprints on the retina, and then the retina generates the whole stream, the whole chain of impressions that then on a high level lead to a cognition which to us seems to be real, but the argument then often is tilted in the direction of like, well, it just appears to be real, much like a dream appears to be real, but it's really just a hallucination where you have an image and then you have another image and then another image. And if you have enough of those images, like in a movie, like in a dia show, that you have frame after frame after frame, then our brain does the job for you and smoothens it out and makes it to you appear as if that segment by segment teleportation of sorts, right? That is like from one state, it changes to the next state, it changes to the next state, that there's a continuity, that this continuity, as well as the change itself that unfolds, is actually an illusion. It's something that how we essentially deceive ourselves. And basically then the culmination of all of this is that consciousness is just an epiphenomena. You just think that you're conscious because that's an illusion, and that in that illusion you think you have free will and all these things, and it's all just appearance and deception and illusion. Yet that would all depend on the image or the stimulus somehow being reassembled, that somehow in our brain then that complex experience which we perceive would have to be reassembled, the three-dimensional reality that we find ourselves in. If that theory would be correct, then somehow in the brain there would be like a computer of sorts, like a graphics department of the neurology, that would have to reassemble the brain, the vision, and project it into a three-dimensional space. And that is simply not tenable from the rate at which the neurons fire and the way how much signal we can process and how complex these processes are, with the image being and the perception being broken up in so many different spaces and at different centers. Again, it's more than 20. So while it seems palpable on his face, like, oh, okay, I can understand. This is like, I'm basically like a good video camera, right? I can look out, there's an image that falls in, I capture it, I generate a chemical signal, electrical signal, the signal gets propagated, and then somewhere it gets stored. And then as a story, it seems very appealing to us. It would be even better if it would be true. The issue is, if we look at this in more detail, and again, this goes back to this paper by James Gibson, I think, talked about it before the episode started, that this is the guy who got tasked with devising tests on how to engineer tests to test people for their neurological capability to ultimately land planes on aircraft carriers. So in a high intensity, high stress, high variability, performance sensitive situations. That means you have to be very quick to respond, to process stimulus, to adapt, to adjust from airspeed to velocity to angle to the boat that is rolling on the waves, and to coordinate all these factors. And that's the conclusion of that study, was that this is absolutely untenable, that there's no way that the brain ever will be able to put these things back together. Which then leaves the questions like, well, where is then that reality? That reality that we seem to perceive, that seems very real to us, that we actually base in the ordinary sense, that we base our existence on, that the foundation of this is material, and from the material reality, we then have, as an extension of sorts, we have subtle impressions, we have like reflections in our mind that then, where we can essentially, again, hallucinate, in the sense, hallucinate, we can regenerate a memory, we can produce a vision about the future, and so on. Now, this is thinking for a moment where I want to take this now, because we also have then Donald Hoffman, who has done excellent work with his evolutionary game theory, where he was simulating the different strategies of what does an organism do, how do they compete if they have an veridical, like a truthful representation of the world, where we perceive the things as they are. And if you perceive things as they are, you will be overwhelmed with so much information and not enough information about not enough meta information, not enough information about how to prioritize the information, that you would just be essentially drowning in a sea of details, not knowing what to act on and not knowing what to filter out, what to ignore. Whereas for operational purposes, that means for everyday living experiences, and that doesn't just apply to the humans, that goes from the animals. And in some ways, you could even say that plants have a tailored perception to what is relevant to them, that they maybe orient themselves more towards sunlight because that is more relevant than to the wind in most cases. But it becomes much more pronounced with animal behavior, where you have the fire element, where you have the breath and metabolism, where you have more immediate actions and responses, and the possible responses are much more complex, right? A plant can kind of grow and turn a little bit one way or another way, whereas a dog can run forward, jump backwards, bite something, carry something, chase something, right? It's like it becomes much, much richer in terms of possibilities. So if you have a model where you adequately represent, veridically, so that means truthfully, the external world, then that's like pretty much the worst. I mean, you could store information that is completely irrelevant. That would even be worse. But as long as you're dealing with situations where you model the external world, this is one of the least efficient ways to organize information, because if you don't have any priority structure, if you don't filter for what is relevant to you for an animal, let's say food or water, or also recognizing threats, whatever that may be, like that can be a cliff, that can be another animal, that can be different types of threats that you want to avoid to keep alive, and resources that you want to pursue because they favor your vitality, your ability to be strong, to respond, to recover. That to mean to some extent that means food in a more immediate sense. In a wider sense, it also means like security, like things like you need to be able to rest at some point. Just for example, in prehistoric times, one of the arguments that's being made why humans prevailed over much bigger animals was that because we are able to to determine a focus and maintain that focus over extended periods of time. And they would sometimes hunt animals on the Hoffman's approach to that we can't possibly see veridical reality. And in the case of Hoffman, he goes a little bit far in the sense of says like, in a sense, the reality that we perceive, the reality we remember, is pretty much is unrelated. What we perceive is pretty much unrelated to the physical reality. He goes very far and says like, look, we deviate a lot from this. To me, it seems he has. Okay, first he needs to make a contrast because it's pretty much the opposite of what everyone else believes. But then he may go a little bit too far in the sense that the reality that we perceive on some level, again, if I go from here, get out of my chair and get out of the house and get into a car, there is at least a continuity. There is a path for me to go from one place to another place. Maybe that looks different. Maybe the size is different. Maybe the perception of size and time and all sorts of things, maybe in an elastic way, that they could be morphed, they could be distorted, right? That's something we can admit for. That maybe I blur out all sorts of things. Maybe I'm unable to perceive, let's say, radio waves and X waves and heat wave, like heat radiation, like all sorts of things that I'm not equipped to perceive properly, that I'm not aware of. Then the things that I am aware of, whatever is more relevant to me, for example, the path that I'm stepping on, I will pay more attention of, whereas the vegetation around, maybe I'm less detailed in my attention. We can admit all these things, and yet in the end, there is a continuity from where I started to where I ended, and that is a logical connection, like simply from a beginning to an end, from a one moment to another moment, that I can have a transformation function. So a continuous transformation from where I was to where I am to where I will be. That has to still be reflected in the physical world, and there's all sorts of more advanced topics that we can also have technical discussions at some point. I'm just for now putting a pin on this, that you have a co-homology. So a homology means how you like that you have two equivalent descriptions. Let's say if I can describe a chessboard and the moves on a chessboard, I can describe it from the point of view of the white player or from the point of view of the black player. And I'm describing the same game, but once I have the reference system of which one is my king and which one is the opponent's king, and once that is reversed. So a similar thing exists in the physical three-dimensional world, how things are connected. And then there's also a corresponding dual where there is a continuity in time. Like I mean, I'm cutting many corners here. We're not going to go into a full-on discussion on this right now, but it's called the De-Ram cohomology, that you have a homology that can every move, any transformation from one point to another corresponds to a complementary transformation. So for example, let's say if I go from here to the car, then one path is the physical path that I actually trace out a physical path. And the complement would be that there is also a progression of time, that as I advance physically, time passes forward and I could roll the whole thing back. So this would be one example where we have two domains that are joined together. However, this is still not entirely satisfactory when we come back to the initial question with the initial question when it was about this retina theory of perception, that we filter things, that we perceive things, and then generate an impression. Because if we cannot have the data available, if it's not possible, if it's not plausible that our sensory organism is rich enough and fast enough to perceive all the nuances that we're aware of, and to then somehow render and generate the high resolution, highly vibrant, dynamic experience that we witness, that we observe, that we encounter, then the only alternative is really that it has to go the other way. And there's multiple reasons why this is. I'm just taking one angle, right? We can also go through logic. We can go through the Bell's theorem and the uncertainty that the physical reality is not determined enough to uniquely define an outcome, and therefore you always have multiple possible futures that then somehow get filtered down, that somehow get constrained. And so from the physical, from the gross to the subtle, since there are more degrees of freedom, more flexibility, again, this is, you can go again back to dreams, and there you also have the situation where multiple alternatives are possible, and they sometimes are exchangeable. And sometimes you wake up in a place that you haven't lived for 15 years, and you step outside and you turn left and you're by a river that doesn't actually exist there, but it was from another place that you lived, and then you walk up down that river, and then you end up on the ocean, even though that specific river goes to a lake, but somehow, right? Everything is very elastic, and in our dream we can very much reassemble things and hide the fact that we're doing that from ourselves, and within the dream it seems entirely consistent. So
Your mic's cut out.
back. 1 2 1 2, check. No? Yes? Okay. I see a signal here. I hope you have some signal as well. So
Yes.
okay. So Hoffman's statement is already quite shocking, that we don't see the reality as it is, that we don't see a veridical representation of reality, but that we have a model which mainly hides most of the physical reality and then represents in a completely transformed way. I don't want to say in a deceptive way, because the deception in a way is there to be in our favor. It's still in a way a distortion, that things get amplified that are usually not so much in the foreground, and things get inhibited even though they will be more prevalent. So that was already quite shocking in terms of what, and Hoffman's work is much more recent than this other work that I'm referring to. Other one was, I think it was commissioned in either 1941, 1942. And let's see. Yeah, James Gibson is the guy, just for reference. And the conclusion of James Gibson was then, well, not only can the physical not be fundamental, we could also argue this with John Bell and with Koch and Specker free will theorem that we referenced before when it came to some of the presentations of John Conway about free will, especially the second installment of his 6-part series there. But it goes even further than that he says, well, what we see, what we experience, the qualities, including the colors and the tastes and all the things that are impressing us in a sentient way, that we have experiences that move us, that touch us, that actually is real, much like the dream. There is a realm where the dream, in fact, is real. And not only is there a reality to that type of realm, but in fact, that is more fundamental than the physical realm. That the physical realm, although very persistent, although very, very solid, very visceral, right? We can have very dense, very tangible experiences. That, in a way, is a projection down, much like if I have a plexiglass cube, I can project it down and I can cast its shadow or the outline of its struts, of its connections onto a plane, onto a sheet of paper or something, and I could just project the shadow. In the same way, what we observe, this three-dimensional reality, is in fact a higher dimension, like a more subtle, more rich, more rich in a sense of like sophisticated, but also rich in a sense of like more elastic, more versatile, much more varied structure of reality, which then, if it gets reduced down, if it gets in a way simplified, it gets simplified down to the common denominator that we all share historically, right? That the evidence, the physical world that we live in, is basically the evidence that we can agree upon. So all the subtle realms, all the visions, all the ideas, all the plans, all the fantasies also, they are not conflicting with each other, right? I can have, I'm going to say, the fantasy or a plan or a vision of either climbing a mountain or going to dive in the ocean, right? And I can entertain both, and they don't conflict with each other. And maybe my friends have even different ideas about, who knows, going on a bicycle ride, or going surfing, or going, right? You have a whole spectrum of things that can all be mutually exclusive, but as an idea, you can entertain it in the same moment. Only when we want to, let's say, write history, the moment we want to play something out, then it matters, what are we going to go for? We're going to make a choice to pursue one thing at the expense of another. Right? If I go downhill, I can't go at the same time uphill. If I go uphill, I cannot go at the same time downhill. And the same way, if I want to do something with my friends, we need to kind of come together and say, okay, we're pursuing one option over another option. And yet, this conclusion basically says, well, in an idealistic sense, the idea, like nature, the nature out of which our thoughts, our ideas, our fantasies, our visions are born, is much more fundamental because it's much more deep than the physical reality. And so it goes more in the direction of some of the shamanic tribe. I'm not sure where this originally comes from, because I've heard it both attributed to the Aztec, so the kind of like the Central American Mayan type of culture. So Mayans are more famous. The Aztecs are a little bit more up in the north, but they have a somewhat related history. But then also the Aborigines in Australia. There's even a connection with some from the jaw structure and genetics, that even in the Terra de Fuego in the south of Argentina, that they may also have a common ancestry with now it escaped me, with the Aboriginals from Australia. And there they have this idea, this understanding that, well, let's say we from the West, we ordinarily say, like, this is the physical world, but the physical world is real. This is where we eat and where we sleep. And when we put our body to sleep, then we go into a subtle realm, And then in that subtle realm, basically it's our subconscious bubbling up a bunch of things. We're either processing things that we haven't processed properly, or we are just exploring things for more or less it's a subconscious on autopilot, that type of way of thinking. The aberration is they look at the whole thing in an inverted sense. They're not disagreeing that there is physical reality, and they're not disagreeing that there is a dream world, and they are kind of two distinct domains. But they say, well, while our food bodies are resting, while we put them to sleep, this is now going more in the direction of avatar. While the avatar is resting, then the subject, the entity, what I would consider myself, my soul, my spirit, is alive and is able to have all sorts of additional freedoms of projecting itself into different possible futures, exploring different scenarios, having different encounters with friends, with people that I know, people that I don't know, people that I haven't met yet, that I haven't in this physical, I'm now speaking from the physical body where I don't have any historical reference, and yet they may be available to me because some indirect relay relationship, that there's a common third party that may know us both and could in principle introduce us, or that there's a pre-existing contact that I don't remember anymore. It's been a long time ago because it's been not even, maybe it didn't even happen within this life. And so I get to arrange and play out things as a kind of like probing the future to explore what would that scenario look like? What would that idea be like? Would it be conducive to my evolution, to my ambition, to my goal, to my pursuits, if I go about things in a particular way? Now, personally, I also always come back to that our purpose here in this very restricted physical experience, the primary function of this is kind of like a gym. We have resistance so that we can exercise and develop a skill, an ability for our mind, for our body, for our consciousness to ultimately refine and develop ourselves. So it's like a gym. You want to have some resistance to exercise against that resistance so that the progress can be faster. So to me, ultimately, I always come to the conclusion that the most important, the most significant, the most meaningful thing is to advance and progress in our evolution, to refine ourselves, to ultimately realize higher and higher states of consciousness until we eventually, invariably, get to rediscover our original nature. And the more we understand ourselves, the more we know ourselves, the more we get to know the nature of humankind. And by that, as an extension, we get to know more and more of the nature of the universe. So by understanding ourselves, we ultimately are able to liberate ourselves from the environment, which is kind of like a gym type training system. Now, with this in mind, I mean, again, so people can have all sorts of value systems. Say like, no, the most important thing is to, I don't know, to acquire power or wealth or whatever else people pursue in this life, which to me seems like, yeah, but that's temporary, right? Even if you have the most amount of wealth or houses or cars or whatever, children in the world, that's still going to be temporary, right? Your life is going to be limited to, let's say, 100 years. You can be optimistic about this and say like, oh, maybe we're going to be able to live to several hundred years. Maybe you think it's possible for humans to get up to 1,000 years, but there is going to be a limit. Even if you say like, we're going to transport the brain to a computer or something, even that will be temporary. Even the life of the sun is temporary. Like there is, even if you project it, you push it further and further with sci-fi fantasies, it doesn't make it go away that it had a beginning, and therefore, by implication, it will have an end, and there's not really any way around this. However, there is the way of transcendence in terms of spiritualization, that you go beyond the very limitations of space and time itself, and then you find yourself in a different way. To me, that seems always the priority, that always seems the more significant aspect of reality to focus on, but I make room that people want to prioritize other things, like people have a freedom to pursue whatever wise or not so wise endeavor that they may pursue. So of course, good idea to reflect about something first before committing ourselves to a not so wise path or trajectory. That's more kind of like a bracket on the side. Now back to the story of whatever you want, whatever you focus on, whatever you take on as a project, as a goal, as a objective. In your mind, in your sleep, the subconscious will bubble up things, quite possibly will play out scenarios, possible scenarios that you could say are just subjective. That's usually where we start out with. But the problem is, the limiting factor is mainly that our memory of dreams is very limited. And if you happen to remember a dream with another person, then even if you have a very vivid recollection, it will be not so likely that the other person remembers that if they had an experience like this that would match, that will corroborate yours, it's not so likely that they will remember it. So that's why it's interesting to have friends that you explore this together with, that you train yourself to remember dreams, and then that when you have that you can keep like a diary and write down your dreams, so that when you end up discovering something that sometimes also feels qualitatively different. There's like some dreams feel a little bit like vague, fuzzy ideas, and some of them sometimes they feel like almost hyper real. Sometimes they feel more real than we're used to the vibrancy of nature, the physical, natural world that we live in. Some dreams feel more real than that, and you will discover, quite possibly, that you are not only limited to a subjective experience. And this is what Aborigines and also the Aztecs and maybe different ancient tribes believed, that this subtle experience is actually primary, and we are shaping the future. We're probing out different scenarios and testing out, what does it feel like this? What will happen like this? How are we going to play out the story like this? What do other parts, like other people that are involved in a particular collective exercise, let's say, how do others make choices and come to a conclusion that then after playing out multiple scenarios, we can come together and say like, well, this is one that we actually like. This is actually one that we want to play out in the physical world. Like we want to condensate it and render it, making it permanent and act it out so it becomes part of a common history, a shared history. And that is also why sometimes we have this sense that something feels very familiar. Of course, there's the phenomenon of a déjà vu where I'm like, wait, this has happened before and I know what's happening and I know what happened. And, you know, that's a very specific sense where something kind of leaks through, where we've replayed and played a scene again and again and possibly modified and changed it a few times until eventually we chose to play it out. But sometimes there's also a sense of familiarity. You go to a place that you know you've never been to. You go to a different city and a different part of the world, a different part of nature, and somehow things feel familiar. And very often, again, you have to evaluate these things for yourself, what you want to assign your credence to. But it tends to be in those moments where something feels a little bit, wait, have I been here before? What's going on here? How does this feel so familiar? That then more often than usual, we have some serendipitous encounter. Something plays out in a particular way or doesn't play out in a particular way. Let's say something that could have gone horribly wrong, just by coincidence, just things just missed each other. And something that could have gone wrong, it doesn't go wrong. And so the story here is basically that these subtle realms are much closer to a blueprint, to a kind of to a primary reality out of which then the physical reality is born. And the physical reality always has to select, right? I can say, what will I do tomorrow? I can come up with 100 different options, but in the end, when I leave the house, there will be a first direction that I'm going to go. I have to choose if I turn left as opposed to turning right. If I go, I don't know, to eat something as opposed to go swimming or to go running or whatever else that I may entertain at the same time, I will have to filter down even more so when it involves others. So this now goes back to this work of Gibson, that he said his conclusion, and he pursued on this conclusion from on a very rigorous foundation of epistemology for, I think, over 30 years, that there is this primary reality, that primary with regards to the physical reality, something that is more fundamental this kind of archetypal blueprint reality, where our physical reality is an image from. And while we have records and documentations and perceptions of the physical reality, much of what we see is actually coming from this deeper reality, like the cognition, the three-dimensional space, for example, the colors, the textures, the qualities, is actually something we directly experience in a subtle realm, much like the astral realm for the dreams. And then it has a physical counterpart as an image, as a type of a shadow that trails, that reflects this richer reality. So in many ways, if you're familiar with Plato's cave, so in Plato's cave, you have a bunch of humans that are, so let me see, how do we do this? So here's a wall, and behind, on top, on top of this wall, it's like a bridge. And down here, there's people sitting here, and they're facing this direction. So they're chained. They can't see up. They can't go back. They only see over here, the wall of the cave. And out here, there's a fire, and the fire casts light, and there's people or beings that are pacing back and front on top of this bridge, and they cast a shadow against the wall. And the people that are chained here, they look at the reflections of the shadows, and they identify with those shadows, even those shadows are cast from the beings above. Like the beings, or whatever, you can have like a cubes or a structure or a chair that casts a shadow against this wall, and the people that are chained here, they look at the shadow and they identify with that shadow. So essentially, the people that are chained, they cannot interact. They perceive a story that is being rendered in front of them, and they identify with that, not recognizing that there's a different layer of reality where these beings that are walking in front of the fire are actually casting the shadow. And they themselves are not fundamental, because the light in the background is the fire that illuminates and projects the shadow. Right? That's kind of the metaphor or the allegory of the cave. And on top of that, the cave has then keeps going and going and going, and eventually far out in the background, there's an opening where the cave goes out, where it opens to the outside world. And from there you have the living daylight, like the daylight that kind of floods into the entrance and kind of by extension into the cave. And the understanding is that not only are we chained in a form where we lack freedom, and we misidentify with the shadows, and the shadows are cast based on objects themselves we cannot see, because right, they are above us and behind us. They are walking in front of the fire, but we cannot see the characters, neither the fire. So not only are we misidentifying with the shadows, not only are we not seeing the characters which are casting those shadows, even more so, we're not aware that there's a fire, and that fire itself is illusory. That fire itself is an artificial source of light that animates the whole thing, because the real light is the living daylight, which is outside. So in the same way, what we see, what we observe as the physical world, is essentially a three-dimensional shadow. Like, yeah, we say it's a three-dimensional world, but it's really a three-dimensional image of a much, much, much deeper reality, of a much more subtle reality. And that reality has primacy with regards to the physical world, meaning we only observe the trace. This does not mean that archetypical reality, the more fundamental reality, is fundamental in the ultimate sense. Because at least I don't think it's healthy or helpful to think of it like that, because that would conflate multiple things. We have the physical world, okay, that's done. Then we have the astral world, where we have our experiences with dreams and subtle perceptions. But the realm where these things are authored, where these things are caused, where these things are generated, come yet from another more deep reality. And then that deeper reality, so you have in the allegory of the cave, you have the humans, the witness, you have the projections, the shadow, and the elements, like the characters above. And then you have the light, which is casting the shadow, which is projecting the things that then turn into perceptions. And yet there is a fourth realm that is beyond them all, and that is the outside world where you have the living daylight. So in Hindu tradition, usually you have the three loka. You have the Bur loka. Bur means like the gross elements, like where you have the Mahabhutas, the gross elements, so the earth, water, fire, air, and space, what we call the physical world. Then you have Bhuvar loka, which is the subtle world, where you have the astral experiences and to some extent also thoughts, emotions, like psychomental realities. And then, so Burloka, Bhuvarloka, and then Svargaloka. And Svargaloka is like the most subtle realm in terms of manifestation. And there you have causality. There you have things to be caused, to be generated, that give rise, that differentiate and polarize into two or recombine into a third. And that's what you have in the Gayatri mantra, for example. It starts out with Om, Bhur, Bhuva, Svaha. Right? Burloka, Svargaloka, Burloka, Bhuvarloka, Svargaloka. And that means the physical, manifested world, the astral, kind of the blueprint out of which the physical is condensated. And then the Svargaloka is, in a deeper sense, the causal realm. And then beyond all of them are kind of, if you want to say, this is like a bubble of the universe where you have all these different realms appear on the physical, on the astral, mental, and on the causal level. All of this exists within what we could call an undifferentiated sea of consciousness. So the consciousness ultimately is primary before differentiation, before it distinguishes itself into complementary poles, before it gives rise to you and me as subjective perspectives, before, ahead of that, being projected into the material world, giving rise to manifested aspects of this world. So we're now going back from the gross, realizing we have a subtle experience, a subtle nature that is more fundamental, then even going further inwards, which is usually not accessible to us in like ordinary waking states or dream states, but we can go there in deep sleep, for example, where we have much less of the surface distractions, and as long as we're able to remain lucid, or we can train ourselves to become lucid in the deep sleep. That means if you're hooked up to an EKG, that there's much less activity. It's not an REM phase where you're dreaming and all sorts of activities going on. It seems like everything has gone to rest, yet you can learn to have experiences of that realm and learn to navigate and operate in that realm. And then there you can begin to perceive causal connections. You can learn to become more deliberate in shaping, in restricting causal contacts, because you want to not play something out, or you want to deliberately cause something, you want to generate the cause. And then all of that is still part of differentiation, it's still part of manifestation. And ultimately we want to go beyond even the causal aspect of you can say the cause of yourself and the stars and the universe. And then there is something even more fundamental, and that is consciousness itself. And consciousness means simultaneously energy, as well as that kind of the sensation of experience. We could call it often it's called ananda in terms of bliss, because any experience that you have, the deepest level of the most essential aspect of any experience is always a type of ecstasy. It's just a very filtered down, reduced down, inhibited, limited ecstasy that we often are able to perceive on when I don't know, let's say if I knock my foot on a stone, what's the ecstasy in that? Well, even though it may be unpleasant, the awareness of itself, the awareness of experience itself has something slightly pleasant to it, even if it's pain. And this can, of course, get distorted and twisted in unhealthy ways, but then sometimes people start to develop a numbness towards the pain, and then in a perverse way, an addiction to the stimulation, the pleasure that comes with the pain. And then that, of course, is not healthy if we are going into more painful situations simply because it's a more stimulating experience. We want to be sure that we are going in a healthy directions, but in principle, you can have a positive experience even in the most painful or discomforting setting. And this has happened in numerous cases, like many cases that have been recorded, is when they, through the Spanish Inquisition, for example, during the Middle Ages, when they were persecuting people, and people that had a high level of consciousness, meaning like they were much more in contact with these deeper levels. They were the veil for them to experience this ecstasy. Sometimes people can go spontaneously into ecstasy because we may have just a moment of peace that suddenly everything seems suspended. I know everything around me, let's say I'm in nature, but there's just like a moment where somehow I see through the superficial appearance of everything, and I feel like I'm in the presence of the divine. I feel like I'm in presence of something mysterious, something mystical, something magnificent. And this is possible even in the most adverse of circumstances. And some of the most extreme cases that have been recorded in multiple traditions, and there's numerous cases of this. Not everyone, of course, but several people that had high states of consciousness that were highly realized in terms of like basically they were a saint, or in some cases maybe even an enlightened being, and through circumstances, through contemporary factors of that period of time, that they were prosecuted, and in extreme cases they were killed. Right, they were burned at the stake. They were put on a big stack of wood, and they were burned alive. And some of them went into ecstasy. So not only did they not feel the pain, right? You could say, well, maybe they're sedated, maybe they're just numb and they're passing out. No, they went into a bliss, they went into an ecstasy, because they were so much in contact with that deeper level of experience that where the ecstasy, where the ananda, the bliss, was direct, and all these superficial layers, at most, what happened when they were basically burning their bodies, like they would remove those layers, and then the ecstasy would take over. Again, these are very extreme cases. This is not something that is not that kind of like try for yourself at home and like put your hand over a candle. It doesn't work like that. That's more a circumstantial environment where the setting can bring something to the forefront and demonstrate it. As a demonstration, it can be instructive, but as a path, this is not the path of the practice, right? This is also like if you have people like fakirs, it's not that they are masochists and they got off on finding a way to cause themselves a lot of pain, but much more the other way around. They developed their awareness and their consciousness and their body awareness and their ability to resist pain all the way to the point where they would become, for example, sometimes they become uninjured on a physical level, even though they have, like, let's say, skin, and then they have glass, and then they have a blanket, and then they smash with a hammer or with a rock or something, they smash the glass and all the glass splinters apart, but somehow it doesn't cut their skin. Right? Every normal person will get cut immediately from like having a broken glass on the skin, and somehow they develop, and their skin is not like, they don't have like a rigid shell or something, but they simply have an inability. They cultivated some sort of power that does not permit for them to be, in this case, to be cut by glass. And of course, there's many other scenarios. Now I just invoked the fakir because this is something that people grasp very easily, of like, hey, wait, but if I get cut physically, right, then that means that there's no way around this. Whereas in fact, it's not so black and white. Now, this is not an encouragement for self-deception, and please don't do any experiments that will be beyond what you can handle, right? You can make like small experiments in a mild scale, but some people have pushed this envelope, and one of the people that has become quite famous with his breathing and And the ice bath is called the Iceman. They pushed it quite far with like even with injecting into the bloodstream.
Wim Hof.
Wim Hof, yes. They did all sorts of like very, very extreme, definitely not try for yourself at home type of scenarios, but in a extremely impressive way. It's really ultimately mind over body. And this this whole story about the consciousness being the fundamental, and then the deeper levels of the mind, this idea-like nature, the idealistic part. Idealistic, I don't mean just idealistic in terms of optimism, but like the philosophy that all the ideas have their own realm of existence, and that ideas are much more fundamental, that they are primary. And then the experiences that we have based on these ideas and visions, let's say dreams, for example, and astral experiences that we play out, are more gross, they're more limited and more finite, that they're more confined. And then from there, if we go all the way down to the most limited domain, then we have the physical world, in which we have the ordinary restrictions. With on the astral, we already have some concept of sequence, of duration, of future, past, of near and far. It's a little bit more elastic, but when we come to the physical, then we have a kind of like this appearance of a singular timeline. Either we did go to the beach together, or we didn't go to the beach together, or we did meet that day, or we didn't run into each other that day, and so on. So coming from the consciousness, filtered through the causal, which is for most cases it's not conscious, and therefore we have limited control because we haven't developed access to that yet, to then through the subconscious and dreamlike astral experiences all the way down to the physical. And yeah, I think it's earth quite shattering to really come to terms with this, that it's not in fact possible for the physical world to determine the future, to determine our life, that in a way all these ideas about the universe being a mechanical machine, that where things are predictable in principle. Yeah, to some extent, yes, if I let a bowling ball fall, it will fall down. If I plant a tree, it will grow. Yes, the future is not absurd. It's not just completely aimless and arbitrary. It is the next moment is born out of the out of the current moment, and this current moment is born out of the previous moment. There is a certain continuity, yet that is not. It's not the present which causes the future, but it's like a different realm that orchestrates the past, the present, and the future. And this ultimately becomes very liberating, because understanding this, understanding not just the physical domain where things tend to be subject to entropy and degrade and deteriorate and fall apart, we can then account for that, accept that tendency of physical reality, that things tend to, for example, degrade physically, and then accounting for that, look beyond and say like, and what's beyond this? What else is there? And then we end up with metaphysics, the study of that which lies beyond the physical, which are not subject to entropy, but which in fact are thriving on entropy, which are consuming entropy like a fuel. And then the fuel of energy, for example, including the elements of like hot and cold. Like the moment we have a contrast between hot and cold, then we can extract work. And that's then how you have, for example, bacteria living in a vent, or near a vent in a deep sea where the water is cold, but there's like some hot jet coming out, and then because of the heat and the cold, they because of the variability, it becomes a type of fuel, and then that fuel can sustain life. And the moment we have life, and that means any type of life, any type of pattern that can maintain itself, that can recreate itself and preserve itself, quite possibly adapt itself if the substrate changes, right? This is the basic idea that we have behind genetics, that there's a genetic blueprint which instructs or guides a process by which environmental ingredients, let's say energy, as well as matter, organic matter mainly, but also minerals and other substances, get reassembled according to some genetic patterns, and then produce a physical support structure that we then call a body. Whether that is an animal body or a human body is secondary. And then the consciousness, so in the deepest level, the consciousness gave rise to all these realms. And now on the grossest level, that impulse comes into focus and begins to assemble a support structure, like a physical organic an organism that then begins to give rise to something in the image of the original. We're going to call it like an idea, the idea of myself, the idea of a human existence on a global scale or universal scale even, and then the idea of an individual human, and then that individual human causally, historically, finding a way to introduce himself, to introduce oneself into a physical form. Physically, this means like there's usually a biological assembly from mother and father, and then eventually you get born as an offspring, and then you inhabit a human form. And so now the universal consciousness somehow condensated, filtered itself down, assembled itself into like a history, a common history as a story of how we got here. And then that gives rise to a biological structure, to a physical structure, to a sentient structure, and then that consciousness gets lodged in that entity. And then we perceive ourselves like, oh, I am me and I'm different from you. But that's simply because that universal consciousness has contracted itself to such a narrow point of view, like an aperture, that now I'm looking, the universal consciousness is looking into the world through me. And me, I'm like the aperture, like my sense organs have become the microphones, if you want to talk about the ears, and the cameras, if you want to talk about the eyes and the senses of taste and touch and smell and so on. And because of this restriction, I appear to myself as an independent, separate thing. But now let's examine this. If I could suspend now, like in a video game, like in a simulation, I could just hit pause and then roll back 5 minutes. Then we would be at the point in time 5 minutes ago, and everything that happened up to 5 minutes ago has happened, and everything that happened in the last 5 minutes hasn't happened yet. So I wouldn't be aware, I wouldn't have any memory of these most recent 5 minutes. I would just have a whole story of where I woke up and what I did all day until I got into this position 5 minutes ago. And then you could say, well, what if you go back another 5 minutes or another hour, another day? You could always play this out, and then you could also roll it back forward again. Like, okay, I allow myself my memory to catch up to this current state. And then I go back again, 5 minutes. But now, not only is this not visible to myself, not only can I, in a way, if I would teleport or transform the whole universe back to 5 minutes, me for myself, everyone else as well for themselves. Now, if we would interchange, let's say, if I wouldn't find myself in the previous version of myself 5 minutes ago as myself, but as you, and you would perceive yourself as me, would you be able to detect that? Because if we switch position, you will have a consistent story, a consistent memory of where you woke up in the morning and what you did all day and how you got up to this moment in time, as would then the other me, right? So this thought experiment reveals that, wait, but that process which I
Sounds
perceive
like
to
it
be
could be a great
myself,
movie, by the way. Great movie plot, fam, if you ever fancy it.
yeah, it may be a little bit requires some skill to put it into scene. But then again, people thought that Cloud Atlas from the book can never be made into a movie, and they did quite an impressive job with like weaving all the different narratives. I'm not sure if I'm up to the task, but it definitely would be interesting to illustrate some of the consequences of this, because that means the whole process of witnessing, the whole process of being conscious, of observing, of cognition, of having a sentient experience, even though it feels very personal to us because we have a very subjective way of experiencing it, that which feels so very personal and in a way intimate to yourself is the same as it feels to me to be myself, as it feels to everyone else to feel and experience themselves. And so in a way, meditating on this and reflecting on this can also be a great source to and approach to cultivate compassion. Because the moment I can see, oh wait, if I'm afraid, that's not really much different if somebody else is afraid, if somebody else is suffering or afflicted by something, let's say it doesn't have food or is too hot or too cold, that's not much different as if I am hungry or if I am too cold or too hot. And so I can extend my feeling or my goodwill, not just, okay, it would be nice if I would be feeling better, but if there's somebody who feels just like I could be feeling, I could also wish and encourage and favor changes that could make it for another person more pleasant, more enjoyable, more delightful. And of course, we have this socially for people that we know, that when we are in contact with people, then it's easy like, oh, of course, I want the people around me, the people I care for, I want them to be happy. But what distinguishes a person that I care for from a person that I don't know? It's just like a lack of experience. It's not that there's any fundamental difference from somebody that I know to somebody I don't know. It's just that I haven't spent time with them. I didn't get to know them, and therefore I'm less aware of their preferences, their needs, their afflictions, their desires, and so on. But it becomes more and more general and more universal until it really doesn't matter that much anymore whether it's you and me. Like, we always have a subjective experience, of course. We always have a subjective biography. But then at the same time, let's say, if the trash is full and somebody needs to take out the trash because otherwise it will start smelling, what really matters is that the trash gets disposed of in this scenario. And it doesn't really matter too much if I'm doing it or if somebody else is doing it. Or if I see, oh, this would be to the benefit of everyone, I might as well do it. And at the same time, it's not about, oh, I have to do it and I need to demonstrate it. And I don't even need to tell anyone that I did it, right? This is where altruism and this type of selflessness comes in, because you simply do things because it's the right thing to do. You're not doing it because you want recognition. You're not doing it because you're getting a reward or some other ulterior motive, simply because it's the right thing to do. And this is part of something that comes with being present, right? If you're present in the moment, somehow all these different layers of reality, they kind of start to assemble themselves. And if you're present without bias, without being distorted through some subjectively motivated agenda, like not because of in a sense, an egoistic agenda, but simply because if you can take a step back and say, like, whether I like it or don't like it is secondary. What matters is the right thing to do. Whether I'm tired or not tired, whether I'm happy or not happy, whether it feels good, is secondary. The thing is, right now, I don't know, something caught fire outside. There's nobody else around. Are we just going to let it burn? No, it's going to create a disaster, and it will be in the benefit of everyone if the fire can be managed or put out. If nobody else is around, then, well, I guess it's up to me. Now, of course, we would like to have things on a limited level that we don't have constantly to put out fires. I'm just taking this as an example that you have sometimes this spontaneous searching forth of let's say there's a well, like a hole in the ground, and the toddler is, I don't know, playing with a balloon or chasing a butterfly and going that direction. There's like an immediate kind of like an alarming response of like, oh my God, I need to prevent. There's like an alarming compassion that is somehow invoked that makes me want to intervene. And I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, maybe somebody should go and save that child, but I feel a little bit tired. I'm not gonna get up now. Like, it's not really an option, right? The moment something is immediate, the moment we're present, the moment we're aware about potential consequences, then there's like a surge that comes up in us. And in many ways, you will find that when you allow this to come through, that many more things end up working out that they could possibly have been planned or set up ahead of time. And again, I would argue this is because mainly causally these things happen on a deeper plane, and then they're in a way primed on this subtle reality. And then on the physical reality, all we really have to do is to cooperate. And we can always lock down and refuse to cooperate, and then things block up, things lock up, things fail, because in a way we let them fail. But if we are simply present, able and willing to be available in response without having an agenda of our own, there will be all sorts of things where things just naturally come together. Everything starts to appear like it's orchestrated by a very elegant plan. And in many ways, even things that seems like that didn't seem particularly realistic, but it just seemed to be the obviously necessary thing to do, you may find yourself again and again in surprising situations where much more was possible than you thought would be possible. And in my opinion, this is because these things have been primed and prepared for on the deeper level, some of them beyond our access for most people, already orchestrated and registered in the causal level. Some of them maybe even go back way before where we have our first memories. And then from there, we have, yes, interactions, imprints from the dreams. Sometimes we get ideas, sometimes we get inspired, and it's not quite clear where it came from. It doesn't seem to come from our history, and yet suddenly we have a thought that we didn't think of before, and it seems to be obviously the right thing. We have no idea how it got here, but it seems to be the right thing to do. And this is maybe a good point to close. I know you have some time constraints, Luke, so
yeah, we can open it up for another half an hour because some like my partner's basically late for chanting today, and normally
okay.
long story, yeah. So we can go for like at least another half an hour. Yes, mate, go, keep going. Yes.
Yeah, so the close what I wanted to bring it to a close here was mainly that this idea of being present meaning like not in the past, not in the future, but simply being with what is in the current situation. And then out of this current situation, being present, there's a sort of action which is inspired, which surges up and forth, and which supports us both with energy, with wakefulness, as well as all sorts of serendipitous occurrences. That from being present, many more things are possible than what they may appear to be. And this again, tend to be biased because the only reference we have is the history, and the history is always filtered down common denominator, right? The further we go back in history, the less information we have available. That doesn't mean that not more things were possible. That just means many things have been left out. So the same time going forward up to the present is like the maximal point of variability where most is possible, where the most freedom is possible is in the current moment. And that means we can go in many different directions. First, the initial requirement is that we are in a way neutral, that we are not limited in or predisposed one way or another, that we are completely open. That increases our degree of freedom. And then from this present state, that we also have a purity of the mind, that our mind tends to naturally be drawn or attracted to or resonant with healthy, harmonious, positive, optimistic directions. And if we have a very impure mind, then even from a maximal degree of freedom, we tend to steer towards problems. We tend to steer towards conflict. We tend to steer into aggravation. And there we need to purify ourselves, refine, smoothen out the edges, the kind of like the rougher parts that steer us into disharmonious or unpleasant experiences or deviate us from our optimal course. We eliminate those. And then we have a kind of like a natural, spontaneous searching forth of spiritual ideas, of aspiration, of curiosities. And from that state, this state of being in the present and being in the open, that's then where ideally, we can go and extend our curiosity towards the mysterious. Because the mysterious, to be in the mystery, is really where we have the most food, the most rich opportunities, encounters, possibilities that come towards us. If we focus mainly on what we already know best, like the trivial, the mundane, the mechanical, it's not wrong, but it's perhaps the least interesting. So instead of focusing on what we already know from the past, which is kind of a given, we have this as a baseline, but then from there, what else is possible? What novelty, what new door is becoming possible, what refinement is possible, what elevation is possible, like to go in a direction from the mysterious towards the mystical, ultimately into full-blown mystical experience, right? That's in a way that the highest form of direction to open is to go in what William James was calling the variety of mystical experience. It can come through in many different flavors, and different people with different belief systems and different histories and cultural background may find it quite different. But the moment you go into the mysterious and you end up encountering the mystical, like that which is beyond the mind, beyond duality, like if you go in a full-on mystical experience, you can have a direct experience and do your best to capture some sort of memory or thought or foothold to then later on being able to relate to it. But in that state, in this mystical state, you're basically fully open to that highest experience, to this ananda, to this blissful experience. And with this experience, there is both awareness and energy, a type of intelligence, but a natural intelligence that floods in together. And it's a type of grace, a grace which infuses you with awareness, with depth of your experience, with recognition of what is, also of what could be, of highlighted possibilities that you suddenly good options start to stand out, or almost you feel like you're naturally being drawn towards serendipitous things that you couldn't have arranged, that you couldn't have planned, that you couldn't have set up ahead of time. And somehow it just happens to be that it's like a natural current where you're carried forward in the direction of life, in the direction of evolution, in the direction of refinement, ultimately sublimation, sophistication in a metaphysical sense, that things from the gross, from the mundane, from the crude become more refined, more rich, more exalted, more subtle, and ultimately going in a direction of mysterious, mystical type of ecstasy. And then at some point you end up floating all the way up and come out on the other end beyond limitations, beyond duality, beyond space and time and personality and all those forms that we have cultivated. And you can still witness them. You may still be able, within this state of undifferentiated consciousness, you sometimes can remember to look back down at your body, at your consciousness, at your mind, recognize your personalities, recognize your limitations, recognize your afflictions, while subjectively experiencing yourself as above and beyond any and all of those. So it's not like the world disappears. It's not like your biography disappears. It's suddenly you realize that you are not determined by your biography, that you're something much more vast, much more sublime. And then that ultimately really is your nature. And then that is the one thing that is fundamental, this consciousness, this awareness of being aware, and that nature of this awareness is a type of ecstasy, that is this ananda. And then from there, we have the armors, these limitations of space and time and so on, that where we separate and distinguish, and then all the way filter down until we find ourselves in a very limited, finite form, and have that supreme consciousness contracted to a single point and lodged into our individual self. And then that's how we end up perceiving ourselves subjectively as you and me and mouse or a cat or whatever else. So
I do have some questions.
yes, go.
Well, following on quickly from that, just throwing a couple of layers, maybe not on top, maybe not below, just throwing a couple of things out there. Robert Epstein, Joe Rogan. He works in maths and psychology. I can't remember which specific field, and computing. Anyway, I'm sure you're familiar with him. The point is, last time he was on Joe Rogan, it was actually quite interesting because it's the first time I've seen Joe Rogan kind of like cut someone off and be like, not going to deal with you, because he was basically patronizing Joe about not understanding that consciousness is a stream and that memory isn't stored physically in the body. So I thought that was really interesting, because for me that makes sense. Like, and then I was kind of just thinking, when people say go with the flow, obviously it's an excuse to do what the fuck you want when you, oh, sorry, do what you want when you want. You can use it that way as well. But I think on its highest form, it's exactly what we're saying. Going with the flow is that presentness, and it's a stream of consciousness flowing in, just like Epstein discusses. But the question is kind of how you direct that stream of energy. And I think, again, that all comes back down to, for me, having a decent moral code and understanding, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the point is, go with the flow, stream of consciousness, Robert Epstein. I think it's an interesting idea. And I really resonate with that idea.
So I'm not familiar with Robert Epstein. I haven't watched that one. I'm gonna have a look for sure. So I can't really speak to his content specifically, but what you described, that people is like, oh, I just want to go with the flow, to essentially to be just make up excuses to not be responsible, accountable, to not make any commitments. Like it's fine if somebody doesn't want to be responsible or not make any commitments, that's fine. But then it's better to be honest about this and say, like, look, I don't want to commit myself to this. I don't want to lock myself in. I don't want to burden myself with something, because then it's honest. Whereas if it's this going with the flow, the prerequisite for this is really to be present. And while that seems very simple, it's like, oh, just presently, I just don't give a fuck. I don't think about future and past, and then I'm being present. But that's not really being present. Being present means like being aware of everything that is as it is, at least within your sphere of perception. That means, first of all, being aware of your physical body, being aware of your breath, being aware of your mood, of your emotions, of your thoughts, being aware of a tendency of your mind, right? To be lucid enough to be aware, oh, I'm inclined to drift this way or that way. And by bringing more awareness, these subconscious tendencies will diminish. And then the more, like, in a way, being aware is a solar thing, right? You have to be awake for it. In a way, it's not, I'm not going to be going with the flow, and going with the flow will somehow guide me towards sitting on a couch and eating chips and watching CSI, right? That's not really going with the flow. That's more like disengaging and becoming more yin and becoming more like a product from the environment, and then kind of like the type of laziness that, and again, I don't mean to judge the CS. I'm just picking some random thing where we go more in the direction of being stimulated, because this is often what people are misusing it for, to say like, oh, I'm saying I'm going with the flow because I just want to do whatever I want to do. There actually is a kind of a, almost like an art form to really being in the flow. And it often comes with a substantial degree of faith, or like at least a very high degree of trust that things will work out. And for example, whenever you go travel for the first time and you go into a new country where maybe you don't know the language, maybe you certainly don't know the culture very much, if you go to a new place, and then how to figure things out, right? It's very tempting. It's like, oh, I'm just going to book the first night. And then once I know where I can sleep, then I'll figure out the next step. And then I get there, and then I kind of am anxious about the next day. It's like, okay, I should decide of whether I'm going to stay here tomorrow, or if I'm going to get a bus or find another way to get transportation to a different place. Maybe I can walk somewhere. Maybe there's a maybe I obtain a vehicle, right? Like we start to plan and structure our day moment by moment. And some people plan for the next year, some people plan for the next few weeks, some people plan for the next day, but it's still planning, it's still about the future. Whereas being in the present, I'm not saying like it has to be like this, but just to characterize a difference. You don't know who you're going to be on the plane with. You don't know who's going to be next to you in a queue. when you, I don't know, when you go through customs or whatever, like steps that you regularly have to go through. And sometimes you may make spontaneous encounters that, precisely because there is not a preset agenda, there's a lot of flexibility. You can be very agile and you can be very free. Now, it's not, I think it's not so interesting if you don't have a plan and you run into somebody with a plan and then they wanted to go somewhere anyway and it's like, oh, you know, why not? Maybe it's going to be very interesting for sure. Often it will lead you to things where you yourself wouldn't necessarily have thought of. Like if I run into somebody else, they may have their own criteria, their own sources of information, their own recommendations for friends that may be different from mine. Doesn't necessarily mean that they may be better, but they certainly are beyond, they are often additional beyond whatever is accessible to me because others have additional resources. So they have on top of what I already have accessible for myself, there may be new things that come in. However, if you run into somebody else who also doesn't have an agenda, then it gets interesting because then you have, or let's say you run into somebody who had an agenda and the agenda got canceled and because something, I don't know, you know, not everyone is able necessarily to be present and bear the uncertainty and that sense of indetermination, which can kind of be quite stimulating. It can be exciting, but it can also be scary of not having a plan. So not everyone would necessarily go to a new country without knowing the language or the currency or just going there and then see, okay, I'll walk out of the airport and then I will find some way to go. I don't know, I'll see what transportation goes, or I I just try to find a way to the beach or to the center of this town. Or, you know, like I just make up an agenda just to see what I'm and then I'm not really committed to that plan, right? If I say, hey, I'm gonna take the subway and I'm gonna go to whatever, the downtown area, and then I pull into a station along the way, and then there's a sign, you know, going for this and this museum, go that way. It's like, oh, I never thought about that there would be a cultural museum of this, but since I'm here now and since this is kind of in my face, I might as well go check it out, right? So not everyone will necessarily be comfortable to be so self-reliant and agile and independent. It means also like physically you need to have a setup. Let's say if you have a big suitcase, you don't want to drag your suitcase around through the city. It will become very annoying. If you have a light backpack, then you will be more flexible, right? There's all sorts of logistical situations that this plays in. So how these things how you can favor these type of scenarios logistically, to some extent you can open yourself up more to them, but it's not necessarily something that you can force. However, it is something you can recognize, because while not everyone maybe is willing to endure that type of indetermination, as you may know, firsthand or secondhand, people are quite able to miss planes and boats and trains and all sorts of things, which that means even though they were planning and being diligent and having like their whole thing worked out, suddenly the carpet is pulled and then they're kind of like in limbo. And some people get worried about that. But if you recognize it from the outside, you can often help somebody navigate this in a way where that additional freedom, right? Okay, they were supposed to be somewhere else tonight and they were supposed to meet something, but they missed the plane. It's not going to happen. Let's say maybe it was the last plane, or it's the other planes are full or whatever. That original plan, we just have to accept that's not gonna, not tonight, not right now. Okay, now we are in a place. There's things to do. There's things to explore, things to discover. Now, what do we do with that freedom? And again, right, I'm just painting a picture. This can, of course, this just as well may be that you have an idea of that you want to hike to a particular place, and then you discover a fork in the path that you never knew existed, or that you suddenly see a sign that takes you to somewhere else, or you run into somebody who says like, oh, look, there's not an official path, but you know, if we go around there, there's actually this other beach or this other hill or this other waterfall that we can go through, and so on. All these things become much more possible when we are present and not preoccupied with an agenda, right? It's useful to be able to have an agenda and to follow through with an agenda if we want to reach a particular goal or destination. However, when it comes to life and our place within our life as it unfolds, it's often quite rich to have some degree of openness to suspend an agenda. Again, that doesn't mean that we're just going to drop any commitment just because we feel like it. It's like, oh, I'm going to go with the flow. Like, no, that's not what this means. It means that despite the ability and the capacity to be deliberate in our choices, in shaping our freedom, there's also an entire spectrum of possibilities to explore, which we don't know ahead of time, which we cannot anticipate simply because it's right. You cannot anticipate who you're going to run into. You don't know what the option's going to be. And the more you are in this environment, and typically backpacking environment is a lot like this, because very often you have other people that are also backpacking, and everyone is kind of like jumping on a whim and following an idea and hearing something and having a part of the information and not quite knowing where they're going and figuring things around. So it becomes, through its indeterminacy, it also becomes very agile, and many things can simply surface in terms of interactions, in terms of experiences that you couldn't have planned, that you couldn't have anticipated ahead of time. And this type of experiences are unfortunately vastly limited, where these days we have often people are very rigid and regimented in their schedule, their life, where they have to be, what time of the day, where they're going to sleep, who they're going to meet, where they're going to eat. We often have so many things fixed in our days that this spontaneous arouse this arousal of simple energy that then can arise and give rise to different scenarios is not all too common, unfortunately. And yes, to some extent, you can always say like, well, I prefer to be safe. I prefer to have things set up. I prefer to have things planned. And yes, there is a good reason to manage, if your plane arrives, I don't know, at 11 at night, and you know that public transportation shuts down by midnight, and you're not in a town like Buenos Aires, which is pretty much 24 every day of the year. But some places they die down at night and there's not much going on. Then sometimes it may make sense to say like, well, depending on the circumstances, I actually want to have a place to go and I want to book something ahead of time so that when I go there, I just get there. Right? That's fine. However, it's always interesting to say like, well, where do I not really have to commit to something? Where can I leave something indeterminate? Where can I leave something open? And, like make it safe so that you're comfortable, right? For example, you can say you go out in nature, bring a backpack, put something to drink inside, put something to eat inside, put, I don't know, a phone, a map, a battery, whatever you need to a credit card, cash, whatever you think you need to feel comfortable, and then just go out and venture into, it's like I like to go out into nature and to random places, whether that is with transport. Sometimes you need to have boats and bikes or transport, and sometimes you can walk. But kind of have like a loose trajectory, not that you're completely disoriented, but a plan, a sketched out outline that you're not really committed to. More like a guiding path that, if nothing else, I'm gonna keep going in this direction. I'm gonna be looking for, I don't know, a trail that takes me to this and this and this place. But I'm very happy to just be deviated at any point along the way, because now your attention is much more open, much more engaged. And you're not just following the trail, but maybe, let's say you see an animal, suddenly maybe you look at what the animal is doing. If you discover something that is more rare, right? Or what other humans are doing. Maybe they have a different plan. And so over time, we can get more and more accustomed to this sense of uncertainty in the sense of like indetermination, because it is a kind of thing that we want to be tolerant to on a visceral level, because it can feel discomforting. It can feel uncertain, even though there's no actual threat, right? Unless we're being reckless, there's many ways of how we can do this in a perfectly safe way to discover new places of nature, new places of reality, even in urban areas, right? If you're more of like a city person, you can go to different places. You can take a random bus that takes you in a different place, and you figure out what's going on there. Because very often what you hear about places is very different from what you encounter once you get there. And then being able to do bear this type of indetermination, somehow on one level it engages your consciousness, your awareness. You become aware of all sorts of nuances because now you don't know what to pay attention to. If you know you need to get to the subway to take the bus to go there, then you are very much in a narrow focused mind because you're trying to solve one thing and go get on the right plane and then not, or get on the right bus and not miss the stop, or get to the cab and give them the right instructions and then play on the phone. It's like we tend to get very much caught up in a very unreasonably limited experience, whereas we might as just as well be present, indeterminate, not knowing where we're going to get on, not knowing where we're going to get off, not knowing where we're going to go. Having some idea is often a good idea in terms of that if I have a good idea of what I would like to go towards, then whatever I encounter, I can kind of evaluate, is this something that is more interesting than my original plan, or is it something that is less interesting? Because I don't just want to get deviated in any random absurd direction just chaotically, because that's its own experiment, right? But in terms of having some kind of like a guiding light and then still being involved in experiences, is something that may serve us well, in terms of that it engages our awareness, our whole sensory perception in a much more rich way than if we go into a, let's say, some people when they train for something, they go in like a almost mechanical robotic way. Not everyone, of course, but for example, for me, if I do something mechanically, I really have to push myself or get myself in a challenging situation so that I am engaged. If I go and I don't know, train against the machine, for example, I will have to do something to make it challenging, to make it interesting. Whereas if I, for example, even playfully practice with somebody martial arts, then because of the dynamism, because of the unpredictability, it's much more easy to be present because you don't know what's going to happen and you cannot anticipate what's going to happen, because otherwise you're going to be focusing on something that doesn't happen and you're going to be ill prepared for something that does happen. So there's different ways. For other people, it may be dancing. For other people, it may be, yeah, like there's, it's always a matter of skill and control, right? If you have no skill and you don't have enough control, you're in trouble, right? If I drive too fast with a bicycle and I don't have the necessary skill to go like downhill on like a trail, I get myself in danger. But if my skill is very high and the path is very well defined and safe and predict, it may be very boring. And so if my skill is higher, then I can increase the challenge. So I end up in this flow state. The flow state is where we're maximally engaged. Like I fully am involved in my experience. I need, with every fiber of my body, I need to be fully aware of what's going on. I'm fully involved, and I cannot be thinking about the future or the past. A very good teacher for this is surfing. Right? If you surf, if you're on a wave, you cannot think about what's going to happen and you cannot remember about other things. You just have to be present and you have to respond to what is going on and how the wave is developing and what and how it's unrolling, and you keep responding and responding and responding in the moment. So that type of engagement is in a way in itself is a skill, and also something that we can become more tolerant to. And you may have your own preference of what you feel comfortable with. I can assure you, the more you go into this, like that's like being in front of other people, right? Being on a stage, having a speech. If we're not used to this, it may be intimidating, it may be scary, but there's not really any actual threat. There's nothing physically threatening that's going to happen. It's just something that is to some extent uncertain, and we may have a strong experience on an emotional or on a mental level. And yet, the same thing that may be a little bit intimidating or scary when we're not used to it, the same thing can become exhilarating and thrilling once we become more comfortable. And suddenly, what we were dreading once can become a huge source of inspiration and joy and even thrilling in another scenario.
Amazing. That, oh, very inspiring. And I love this idea of indeterminism as uncertainty. That's sexy. That's very sexy. Woo! And I'd never thought about it. I never made that connection. That's magical. And yeah, from my own experience, I think like yeah, like the flow state, I think, is the experience that most people could have come closest to in some sense. And I think like most people would have achieved something that they never thought they could have achieved. And they didn't even think about it, you know? It's like, oh, how did I do that, man? Or something like that. I think that's the closest state I can think of on the physical realm to like it just happened in the sense of like oh, there was that video going around Instagram the other day of that guy, of this NFL player, like jumping, swiveling in the air. And he was like, yeah, I didn't even think about it. Like it just happened. Like, and it's that stream of consciousness. And then my experience beyond that kind of physical realm. And this is, I think, where it ties in nicely to where we've kind of where we have explored ideas of worldviews before and thinking about this systemic thinking. Because actually, like when I was younger, I was, you know, it's a more materialist realm, and I was kind of trying out these theories and and my worldview was restricted in that sense. And then the flow wasn't there. I wasn't able to be present or something like that. Anyway, the point is that once my worldview expanded into a more monistic worldview, then I started to develop faith. Because basically, what I'm trying to say is, before I couldn't let go of control. I felt I was scared, so I had to control everything. Like there was a fear there that if I don't control this, I lose control. And if I lose control, I die. And me dying is a tragedy. And then I kind of came gently towards the other side or to the middle, where it's like, oh, well, no, maybe to fate. I don't know. It's not point. The point is that then my worldview expanded and I was able to think about time and space. And then I was able to think about beyond time and space. And I was able to really stretch these ideas. And that's where my faith came in. And then in understanding how what we're talking about with regards to the like being present and letting go and not like attaching myself to any outcome and just being in the moment and accepting everything as it is and doing my best. And that's all I have to do, to be present and aware, but not even really doing that ideally because it just happens. And the results, I mean, that the fruits are ridiculous. Like, for example, like I'm having some really tough conversation with somebody about something, and I'm just, my intention is beautiful. My intention is to be present, to listen. And they'll ask me some question about something. And in the moment, I can feel that I don't know the answer. And I'm just like, oh, wow, I really can't remember this. God, can you give me a little bit of help here? Like, point me in the right direction, something like that. And then all of a sudden, oof, the answer's there. Everything comes back. And the more I've learned to let go, the more comes into me. The more, it's like I have a higher bandwidth. That's how I can describe it. And that bandwidth just increases and increases and increases. And then it, in that sense, I'm presented with the opportunities that will enable my evolution of my higher self. Obviously, I get presented with the opportunities for my lower self in terms of, let's say, drugs, alcohol, something like that. But for me, like being able to really understand how, or at least be aware of different ways of mentally modeling reality, that enabled me to be able to let go. And then when we talk about the mystical and the magical, dude, I got goosebumps all over. Like people would talk to me about like, you know, like I've always been open-minded. I always chat to people about everything and like, oh yeah, God this, God that. And I'm there like, you know, little smart, skeptical scientist at like 23 who's read a few whatever, done a few whatever. And And I remember, and now I look back at that and I'm just like, wow, I've come such a long way. But the point is that like letting go but letting go within a direction. It's not completely kind of letting go because I'm still a person in the physical world. I'm not a monk. Like I can't just be like, do you know what? No bills, no this, no that. I'm not even going to handle money for the rest of my life. Or so, it can happen. But again, just tying it all back together. And then for me, thinking about letting go of control in the sense of controlling all of the outcomes. And then I'm not focusing on a future state that I want to create. I'm not thinking about something in the past that's going to stop me. I'm just continuously being present. And then, but the direction for presentness is loving compassion, kindness, empathy, and all of that kind of higher energies that I can think of. And then for me, just the most amazing, magical experiences happen. It's like the other day I was sitting, I was doing really hard practice for like, not really hard, really deep practice for like 3 or 4 weeks with yoga and Buddhism. And I'm just throwing some stuff, and it's happened to me a lot. This isn't just like I can tell you more incidents. And I'm sitting there with my landlord who I rent the house from. We're talking about how to make compost. Long story. I'll keep it short. And I'm like, oh, do you know what? I could really do with some green leaves right now. What if one of these trees could fall down and give me some green leaves? That would be amazing. Literally 2 seconds later, we hear this like it's like a lightning crack of like, how trees break, like, and then all of a sudden this huge tree just falls to the ground. And my landlord looks at me and he's like, and we're both thinking the same thing, do you know? He looks, because he's Buddhist as well. And he's looking at me, he's like, who's this guy? Like, dude, what's going on here? And for me, like things like that, just they keep on happening, especially when my energy is pure. Like when I'm not, when I'm eating clean, when I don't smoke, when I don't drink, when I don't anything, when I'm practicing, when I'm subliming my energy every morning, like the experiences and the opportunities and the serendipity and the synchronicities. Like this, how can I go back to any other existence? Like I will eventually, in some sense, with rebirth. But on this plane, in this reality now, it's that's my experience of how mentally modeling the world and attuning into different energies and really experimenting with reality is like, and everyone's like, Luke, why are you always so happy? How are you always so happy? Why are you always smiling? And I'm like, wow. Watch the Quantum Archipelago.
Yeah,
Anyway, I
it's
just wanted to kind of put that out there as a inspirational little piece about letting go and yeah.
yeah, and it's of course, like you say, this tendency, this temptation to control, right? It's ultimately the mind who wants to control things, and the mind through this disconnect from separation from the not being present wants to control more and more things out in the future trajectories and possibilities. This is like Walt Whitman said that the greatest faculty of us humans is that we can let our ideas die instead of us, right? We don't have to just play things out and run into trouble and die, but we can, with our mind, anticipate things. This is going to work out well. This is not going to work out so well. And then this is a big strength that we have, that we can explore with our mind options and then choose the ones that are healthy, good, benevolent. At the same time, there is a bit of a difficulty with this, that it's so tempting to go there too much, especially with the way we live our lives, that we don't really have any grounding is sometimes a word that is being used, right? That we are involved in the physical world in a way that it leads to this kind of escapism. Whether that is deliberate or not is not the point here, but simply trying to solve things ahead of time, which is usually motivated by some amount of fear, some amount of anxiety to take decisions, to make preparations, then that further creates more and more of the disconnect, because there's like the mind's tendency is to separate, to insulate. And so from however we live our life, sometimes people have a very regimented life or need to plan things very much in advance or have a lot of certainty or a lot of clarity ahead of times. Then I would say, it's best to simply explore things safely, tape off a scenario, a time, an afternoon or something where you can kind of aimlessly explore something, just to get a sense of like, what is it like to go and wander, not to go hike from A to B, but to almost like wander aimlessly. And then through these experiences and through this ad hoc decision making of taking decisions and responding things, naturally this a sense of confidence and ultimately faith will naturally arise, because the more we do it, the more we are used to it, and the more we live in this state, the more natural it feels, and the more our subconscious also accepts that yes, there is a kind of like a cosmic intelligence that is also in the mix, available to assist us. We can ask for things, we can support ourselves by becoming deliberate in our intention, in our choices, in our preferences, without making plans about it. Just like, oh, today, I don't know, I'm more curious to explore this, or even an aimless. I'm just curious to see what I find out there in the world. And the more we do it, the more we get used to it, and the more we can sink and relax into this type of experiences. And yeah, anyway, I just wanted to kind of give some minimal amount of foothold to just encourage people to explore this, as this will by itself reveal many things. And again, the starting point is start with your best foot forward, be open, be relaxed, have faith, and then be just know that whatever happens along the way, whatever happens, you can always, in the next step, you can always make a different choice. You can always change something if you don't like it. It's not about getting the best possible experience, but rather about getting acquainted with all the whole range of possibilities that are there, because very often we miss most of them because we're locked into some, which very often is not the best. I'm not saying it's not a good one, but very often there will be additional things that will be much more interesting. And so I just want to encourage people in general to explore this a bit more.
Amen.
So,
Amen. I love it, Fab. I love it. Yes. Perfect. Thank you very much. As always, thank you, thank you, thank you. Take care of yourself. Take care of
glad
yourself,
we had some extra
everybody.
time, and have a lovely rest of the day, and then see you in the next round.
Yes. Namaste.
Okay. Bless you all. Bye.